Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to our webinar titled Navigating Geopolitical Disruptions, the Theory and the Practice of Resilient Operations and Supply Chain. We are thrilled to have you with us today in its timely and very important topic about disruptions in order to have an insightful discussion about this topic. Around the world, organizations are navigating increasing level of uncertainty. This stems from wars, political unrest, global pandemic, and trade fragmentation. All have put a pressure on the systems that keep businesses and societies moving forward. Today's session brings together a distinguished group of international scholars to explore how firms can build operational and supply chain resilience in the evolving landscape. So this webinar, it's hosted to you under the OSCM Division MENA Region Ambassador Team. This ambassador team is as a part of the OSCM Division in the Academy of Management. So first, I would like to introduce to you our team. So we have Dr. Muhammad Al-Ghababshe. He's Associate Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management at Mu'ta University in Jordan. And also we have Dr. Muhammad Mushtari. He's Associate Professor of Supply Chain Management and Academy of Finland Research Fellow at Tampere University in Finland. And finally, myself, Assistant Professor of Operations Management, Rima Hassan at the University of Jordan in Jordan. So in our team, we try to bring the operations and supply chain management scholars connected with the main and with the international operations management and the Academy of Management, but also across the world. So we create different initiatives and webinars in order to have this and discuss some topics and relevant topics in the area of operations and supply chain management. So today in our session, it's our honor to be joined by esteemed scholars who bring rich and interdisciplinary perspective from across the globe. So we have with us Professor Grazia Santangelo. She's a professor in strategic and international management at Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. We have also Dr. Samuel Roscoe. He's a lecturer in operations and supply chain management at Sauder's School of Business at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Also, we have Dr. Srividya Jandhyala. She's Associate Professor of Management at ESSEC Business School in Singapore. So welcome our esteemed professor, and thank you very much for being with us today. In our agenda, we will first, after this introduction, we will start with the presentations from the speakers. And after that, we will have a panel discussion where myself as a moderator will ask some questions to the speakers. And then we will have a presentation from Grazia and Srividya about the AMP special issue. And finally, we'll have questions from the audience, and then we will be closing by talking about the next step of our team. So thank you so much for being with us, our esteemed scholars, and we are looking forward to hearing from you. In the beginning, we'll start with a presentation from Grazia. She will talk about her research. So Grazia, if you would like to share any slides, and I will also introduce you to the audience.
Yeah, I have no slides to share, so I'm just going to talk about the piece. Fine.
Perfect. Yeah. So may I introduce you to the audience first? So Grazia, she's a professor of strategic and international management at Copenhagen Business School. She's a researcher. Her research is across different fields in international business, global strategy, and innovation management. She has studied the evolution of firms' internationalization process and how firms strategize their intangibles like knowledge and reputation across borders. Her recent research concerned with multinational enterprise strategy in the context of geopolitical risk, and also global challenges. Her research was published in esteemed journals, academic journals in the area of business management and Journal of Economics, Geography, and Organization Science, and other international and esteemed journals. So thank you very much, Grazia, for being with us today. And the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak at this webinar. Just very briefly about my most recent research, which as Rima has anticipated, concern, among others, geopolitics. I have actually recently explored both geopolitics and supply chain resilience, although in a separate stream. So on the geopolitical side, I focus on how multinational enterprises respond strategically to protect their physical and intangible assets from geopolitical risk. In particular, I am interested on how firms use organizational architecture and institutional arbitrage to create distance in order to reduce political visibility and manage exposure in volatile context. I'm also interested on supply chain resilience, as I mentioned. So my work look at the trade-off that firms face in building resilient global supply chain. And one key tension that I am interested in is the trade-off between resilience and sustainability. So in some cases, achieving supply chain resilience lead firms to rely on supplier in institutionally weak country where inputs may be more cost efficient or available in time of disruption, but often at the expenses of environmental or labor standards. So why I haven't directly connect these two streams, I see strong potential to do so. The intersection of geopolitical strategy and supply chain design is becoming increasingly relevant. And in my future research, I'm very interested in exploring how firms balance geopolitical risk mitigation with resilience and sustainability objective in practice. I think I'll stop here so that we have time for discussion afterward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grazia, for your presentation. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Also, our second presenter is Dr. Samuel Roscoe. So Dr. Samuel Roscoe, he's a lecturer in operations and supply chain management at Sauder's School of Business at the University of British Columbia. He is an expert in geopolitical disruptions, tariff and trade wars, and how they impact global supply chain. His research on the US-China trade war and Brexit COVID-19 has been used by the UK government ministries to set policies and around managing supply chain risk during that time of extreme uncertainty. Dr. Roscoe, he has recently appeared on CTV News and the CBC and Global News to discuss the Trump administration latest tariffs and the disruptions causes to global trade flows. So, Dr. Samuel, you are welcome in our webinar. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Oh, hi, and welcome. I really appreciate being here today. That's great. Yeah, just in terms of my research, I would say that this is a very exciting space to be in at the moment. And anybody researching geopolitics and supply chains, you've picked the right place to be. It's very exciting. A lot of people are interested in it, getting a lot of media attention, as well as from policymakers, etc. Everybody wants to know what is going to happen to my supply chain as a result of what President Trump has been doing, or what has been happening in the past. What can we learn from the things that have happened in the past? So what my research has been looking at is we explored how pharmaceutical companies dealt with the UK leaving the European Union 2016 to 2020. I've also been researching how automotive firms, engineering firms, as well as pharmaceutical firms have been dealing with the first wave of the US-China trade war between 2018 and well, until today. We also looked at COVID and all of the different vaccine nationalism type policies. We looked at how restrictions to the movement of people as well as commodities during COVID impacted supply chain design. And most recently, I've been taking the learnings that we have from the US-China trade war and how pharmaceutical companies actually change their supply chain designs as a result of tariffs during the first wave of the US-China trade war, and trying to learn how companies are going to respond to the current trade war between the US and China, of course, which is such a huge geopolitical disruption that is affecting companies in all sorts of different ways. What we're trying to do is look at what happened with companies and their supply chains in the past. How did US companies operating in China, how did they shift their production? How did they change their supply chain design? Did they move to sort of nearshoring? Did they move to regionalization, localization strategies? And we're trying to kind of take that research and give companies today forward guidance on how their supply chains are likely to change as a result of Trump's latest tariffs on China and the reciprocal tariffs that China has put in on the United States. So it is, like I said, very topical, very interesting, and it's always a very fresh area of research. So it's great to have everybody here and for such a big group of scholars to show an interest in this topic.
Thank you so much, Samuel, and we're looking forward for our conversation and questions. Thank you so much. Our third presenter is Dr. Srividya Jandhyala. She's Associate Professor of Management at ESSEC Business School in Singapore. Her research focuses on global strategy, geopolitics, and international business. She is the author of The Great Disruptions, How Geopolitics is Changing Companies, Managers, and Work, which is published at Cambridge University Press in 2025. Her award-winning research has been published in a wide range of top academic journals, including the ASQ, Administrative Science Quarterly, Strategic Management Journal, Journal of International Business Studies, and many others like top management journals. She is Associate Editor at the Global Strategy Journal. She teaches courses ranging from strategy, international business, geopolitics in the undergraduate, graduate, and executive programs. Prior to joining the school in Singapore, she served as a faculty at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She was previously a Fung Global Fellow at Princeton University and received her PhD in management from Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. Srividya, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rima. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm excited to participate in this panel. I think I echo what the previous panelists have said in terms of this being a very exciting topic and very relevant as well. For my own research, I've had a long-standing interest in the politics of foreign direct investment. So I've been interested for a long time in what are some of the political factors that influence how companies go abroad, invest abroad, how those political and institutional factors influence the company's strategic choices. Some of this I build into my book, which is coming out this summer, The Great Disruption, How Geopolitics is Changing Companies, Managers, and Work. So in other work, I have been looking at specifically issues of property rights, how multinational corporations strategically assess, react, and manage differences in property rights. I've looked at the role of international treaties, dispute resolution mechanism, geopolitics, specifically diplomacy, political risk. And so this is my broad area of research. These are the types of topics that I've been thinking about. Supply chain is one area that is strongly affected by all of these above mentioned issues. And so I think these challenges are being magnified. Some of these challenges are being magnified in supply chains. And it makes me, want to call out a quote by Mark Carney, who recently was elected in Canada. But a few months ago, he remarked that the world is at a moment where the accepted forces and policies that have been in place virtually my entire adult life are changing. And I think that's very much true in how we have taken for granted many assumptions about international business and where companies put their supply chains and how they navigate those supply chains. And so I think that's a very interesting set of questions. And I'm looking forward to discussing more about that. I think supply chains are a context that is worth understanding, because when we think about geopolitics, most of what we tend to think about in the geopolitics, the traditional way of thinking about geopolitics is about energy security or national defense. These are the types of industries that we traditionally tended to associate with big geopolitical implications. But we can ask ourselves, like, why is it that where my shoes are made or where my music video is coming from, why are these at the center of geopolitical tensions around the world? And I think it's a very interesting context, and I'm looking forward to sharing more on that in our discussion.
Thank you so much, Srividya. It's also a pleasure to have you with us today. So now we will move on to our next part of our discussion, which is about the panel discussion and the questions for the panelists. So the questions will be in multiple themes, starting talking about the nature of the geopolitical disruptions, resilience, and also the implications of governmental policy, the implications of technology and innovation. And then we will talk about some practical and implications to policymakers and to managers. So let's start by setting the stage. So in recent years, we have witnessed everything, like from pandemic to war to trade war. And I think you mentioned, I mean, some of these in your presentations, like a few minutes ahead. So these aren't just headlines. These are some strategic turning points for companies. And my first question for you, for all of you as a panelist, so how have these global geopolitical shifts alert how global supply chain are designed and managed today? So what's your perspective into that?
We follow the same order, or I don't know how you organize that.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
Okay, so recent political event from the war in Ukraine to the US tension, export control, and the pandemic have profoundly reshaped the global supply chain strategy. And we are seeing a clear shift from efficiency-driven model to more resilient-oriented model. So for decades, the supply chain were optimized for cost, often relying on single country sources or just-in-time inventory and lean network. But the recent disruption have exposed the risk of that approach. So now companies are actually reassessing how and where to produce and procure. So one major change is diversification. So firms are reducing overdependence on any or one country or region and spreading risk across multiple geography. This has been the trend like the China +1 or broader friendship shoring, where production is shifted to politically aligned or lower risk country. Another key shift is toward regionalization, so bringing part of the supply chain close to end market, especially for critical inputs like semiconductor, pharmaceutical, or clean tech. So governments are also playing a larger role there, offering incentive for reshoring or mandating local content in strategic sector. At the same time, companies are investing in supply chain visibility and scenario planning. So there is a great demand for digital tool, data sharing, risk analysis to anticipate where the next bottleneck of disruption might arise. So in short, recent geopolitical shock have turned supply chain from a cost center into a broader level strategic issue. And the question is no longer just how cheaply can we source, but how safely, sustainable, and reliably can we operate in an uncertain world. And I think I stop here and go to give the floor to Samuel.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that last point, because I think that has been the biggest shift in business supply chains is, companies up until, I would argue, probably up until around, well, let's say the pandemic did treat supply chains essentially as a cost center. So it was all about how do we minimize our costs? How do we have the most efficient supply chain possible, using some of the techniques that Grazia was talking about there around lean and efficiency, sourcing in low-wage economies to take advantage of low-wage labor. Of course, then the pandemic came along and all of a sudden we weren't able to get supplies onto store shelves, and companies finally realized, well, it doesn't matter how low cost my supply chain is if I can't actually get any products onto store shelves to sell. So that was a very rude awakening for a lot of businesses who were sourcing things in China and Southeast Asia and bringing them back to Europe and to North America. They realized that long lead time supply chains in particular, we're not particularly resilient to disruptions such as COVID that hit us quite quickly and then spread very rapidly. COVID was a real equalizer in terms of being this huge disruption that affected supply and demand at the same time. And there's not many global events that hit supply and demand at the same time, other than maybe World War II, for instance, but there's not a lot. So companies really had to kind of wake up to this reality that if we have these long, globally dispersed supply chains and there is a disruption, we are essentially, the fundamentals of the supply chain are not resilient because we are not responsive. We cannot bring products to market quickly enough. And we do have to look at redesigning our supply chains in such a way that we can be more responsive. And what's interesting now is we've gone from COVID and we thought, okay, well, sort of, COVID is winding down, let's say 2022. Then, of course, we had the Russia-Ukraine war. We've also had conflict in the Middle East. And then we've had the election of President Trump. And literally in the past 3 months, the entire world has changed again. And businesses are now having to look at their supply chains and thinking to themselves, well, what does friendshoring really mean? So if I'm an American business, who are my friends now? Do I have friends? Have I alienated in the entire world because I put tariffs on everybody? And the whole concept of friendshoring, in my opinion, is taking a very different meaning, especially for US-based businesses, because there has been this upset. And again, I love that Mark Carney was quoted earlier because he's now our Prime Minister here in Canada as of 2 days ago. And basically what he's pointed out is, the world order is changing. The US is no longer sort of the leader of the democratic world. They want to move towards more protectionism. They want to secure their borders. They want to secure their critical supply chains like semiconductors. You look at even Biden with his Supply Chain Act. He was not just about semiconductors, it was also about EV batteries. So there's a 100% tariff now in Canada, the US, Australia, as well as the EU on EVs coming from China. So that also shifts the EV supply chain quite substantially. And then you have this push to have pharmaceuticals onshore. You have a push to have veterinary medicines onshored, as well as AI type related equipment onshored. And that movement is happening in the States. So we have this push towards diversification in businesses. Companies realize that we need to kind of not be sort of situated in one place, but at the same time, you have this government pressure that's coming in the opposite direction, especially from the States. And they're saying, actually, no, we don't want diversification. We want protectionism. We want everything here. Bring your manufacturing onshore, locate everything here. And that has this counter effect where businesses are now saying, okay, well, do I have to onshore? Do I, am I going to fall to these tariffs? Am I going to now have to make everything localized within the United States, at least final assembly, I should say? And then do I sort of give way to these political pressures? So there's so many interesting dynamics going on at the world, and I could talk about it for hours, and I normally do it in my lectures with my students, so I won't bore you here. But I think there have been some very, very fundamental shifts, and we can explore those as we go.
Thank you so much, Samuel, for your insights. Srividya?
Thank you. I think I'll echo some of what has already been said, but I tend to think of these effects of these recent geopolitical events under 3 lenses. One is where is work being done? So this is about location. This is about thinking, going from just in time to just in case, increasing resilience, duplication of functions, having local for local production. So these kinds of issues that are related to the location of where work is being done. And that has obvious implications for things like organizational structure. It has implications for how companies distribute the work within a multinational enterprise, for example, or where they prioritize having suppliers from. So I think this has big implications in terms of organizational structure, as well as how companies have contracts with different suppliers. So we can think of companies that are companies like AstraZeneca, for example, that have been very clear about their local for local approach, right? So we have an independent supply chain that is going to target US, Europe. We have a separate supply chain that we want to build that will be serving one of our largest markets, which is China. So the idea of where work is being done is one element. The second element that I tend to think about is how work is being done. Right? So this goes back to Grazia's earlier point about supply chains going from cost center to being a strategic issue, right? So supply chains are moving, but this means this is changing the job description of managers, right? So more people within companies are having to navigate these kinds of issues. They're having to learn about customs rules. They're having to learn about tariff rates. They're having to learn about managing political activities. They're having to discover how when new trade policies are announced. So within companies, there's a big shift in the job description of people who are tasked with navigating these issues. And for some, this has actually become a full-time job, right? So there are companies that have now set up war rooms where people are just trying to keep themselves updated with so much change that is happening every single day. Large-scale shifts in supply chain also create a change in work culture. Right? So moving supply chains obviously is a difficult thing, but when you're moving large-scale supply from, let's say, one country to another, or even from one supplier to another supplier, we're really talking about large-scale disruption to work culture, good or bad, right? So it could be positive, it could be enhancing, but it could also be dramatically different from what you're doing, and could be harmful in that way as well. So when you have Foxconn trying to suddenly now increase and start producing iPhones in India instead of China, then we have to kind of take into account how this is affecting the local labor force, how this is affecting large factories that house tens of thousands of people in one location. So this is also changing work culture. So that's my second point about how work is being done. And then my final point is who does the work, right? So I think these geopolitical events are also shaping global supply chains because they influence who does the work, right? So work by foreign nationals, by foreign companies that we used to think of as just being efficient are now being questioned. So who is considered to be allowed to do this work, I think also is shifting. And especially the work of experts is constrained, right? So experts, depending on where you are, depending on the geographic location, depending on the country, is constrained in different ways. So overall, I think the effects are felt in terms of where work is being done, how work is being done, and who does the work.
Thank you so much. Very interesting, to highlight these three pillars and three lenses. My second question is what makes geopolitical risk different from other types of risk? So natural disasters, cyber threats, are they more unpredictable or just harder to manage? So how do you see them different or similar in which way? So Grazia?
Yes. So what distinguishes geopolitical disruption from other type of supply chain like disaster or cyber attack, I believe, is the strategic intent, duration, and unpredictability of geopolitical disruption. First, unlike a natural disaster, which are typically localized and time-bound, geopolitical disruption often unfold over months or years, and are shaped by deliberate action, such as sanction, trade, restriction, regulation, retaliation, or even the weaponization of standard legal system, what Samuel was mentioning before. So in a way, they are not random shock, they reflect a political and economic calculation. Second, geopolitical distraction tend to have a broader and more systematic impact. A flood might take a factory, a cyber attack might cripple a data center, but a geopolitical conflict can affect the entire region, trigger a secondary effect across industry, and reshape global sourcing and investment decisions for the long term. For example, if we think about the Ukrainian war, it just disrupts energy and agriculture, it realigns political alliances and push firms to reconsider their exposure to Russia and by extension, other political risky markets. Finally, geopolitical disruption often come with a reputational, ethical, and legal dimension. So company must navigate not just operational risk, but also stakeholder expectation, compliance with the evolving sanction regime, and sometimes the moral implication of continuing business in conflict zone. So if you think about the backlash that a lot of foreign companies have faced in Russia in the aftermath of the Ukrainian crisis. So in short, while other risks can be severe, geopolitical distraction are unique in how intertwined they are with power, politics, and long-term strategic positioning. They don't just disrupt, they reshape the rule of the game, something that has emerged already from what Samuel and Vidya were covering in connection to the previous question.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Samuel, what's your perspective into the differences?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm just thinking here about how to kind of define them, because they are different. If we look at a natural disaster, for instance, and of course it depends on the severity of the natural disaster, but these tend to be an event that occurs, and companies have this initial response phase, then they move into recovery, and then they kind of go back to sort of business as usual on this idea of supply chains being resilient, the ability to bounce back to where they were, or if not improve. Now, when we look at geopolitical events, however, what you have are a lot of what I would call unintended consequences. And those are different because you don't really get that from a natural disaster. With a geopolitical disruption, you have intentional, deliberate behavior that is targeted at another nation state. And what tends to happen is the other nation state or states react. And when they react, you have these unintended consequences. So I'll give you an example of the US-China trade war currently. The Trump administration has put in tariffs on China. It started off at, it was around 45%. Of course, then China retaliated, and then the US said, okay, well, if you do that, we're going to double it to 85%. And then China said, go ahead, we are going to double our tariffs as well. And now we're at this situation where tariffs are at 145%. And we literally have sailings coming from China into the west coast of the US that have been cut by 45%. We have vessels that are traveling empty from China to the United States. And that's all happened in the past month. And we also have other unintended consequences. Well, I think it's unintended anyway, around the US dollar. I see a question here from Benit, and I'll just try to answer that, Benit, while I'm talking, is we have this sort of this devaluation of the US dollar. And if it is intentional, the reason that the US administration is doing that is because they say, well, when we begin to manufacture in the US, this will make our exports to the rest of the world more attractive because the US dollar will be cheaper. But the issue is when you have a cheaper US dollar now, it makes it a lot more expensive to import products from, of course, from China and from the rest of the world. So you have US companies now that are having to pay import tariffs, and they're also having to pay it with a weaker US dollar. So the unintended consequences there are cancellations of orders from Chinese factories. And we are already beginning to see shifts from Chinese factories to Vietnam factories, especially in textiles and apparel, things that are relatively easier to move. And we are also seeing it with sort of the kids' toys and these types of things that are easier to sort of move between manufacturing facilities. And we're seeing an uptick in exports from Vietnam, a decrease in exports from China. And these are things that I would imagine that the US administration did not really anticipate happening. So the unintended consequences of geopolitical disruptions are more than likely going to be empty shelves at US retailers. And Walmart, and you have Target, and you have all of these big box retailers have actually been banging on President Trump's door and say, you have to change these tariffs. Our shelves are going to be empty in a month. And unfortunately, I think that is going to be the case. Actually, not in a month, it's going to be in the next week or two. So the difference with geopolitical disruptions is, in my opinion, these unintended consequences and this ripple effect, and these, what starts off as one targeted action can very, very quickly escalate into a full-blown trade war, and that's where we are now.
Thank you so much, Samuel. Srividya?
I found the previous perspectives really interesting. I think for me, the biggest difference is that geopolitical risk is about corporate nationality. The fundamental defining feature of geopolitical risk is corporate nationality. It is about who you are and where you're from. That's the defining feature, and that makes it different from other types of issues. It is not about competence. It is not about commitment. It is not about culture. It is about where this company is from, and basically, where are you really from? That's a question that everybody is asking, and that's defining the risk that a company faces. And why is that the case? I think that's the case because if we kind of work backwards, why are global supply chains even at the center of discussion today? After all, they're efficiency enhancing in many ways, but and many of these products, right? So whether it is toys, and Samuel was mentioning some of these examples, these are not the kind of traditional issues that we tend to associate with big geopolitical, the center of big geopolitical discussions. But I think there's at least two reasons. One is that a lot of this is about data, which can be used in different ways. So many companies are increasingly holding data, and data security, data sovereignty is becoming an important issue. Second, and most importantly, I think governments really worry about negative externalities. Right? So if you have global supply chains, if you have foreign investment, they worry about the negative externalities. And those negative externalities are much more consequential if they believe that there is a foreign actor, there is a company from a foreign country that is more of a rival than an ally. Right? So fundamentally, is this advantage that this company is bringing, is this operations of this company going to somehow have negative implications for my economy, my security, and whether it does or not is making a statement about where that company is from rather than what it does. Right? It's not about the competence of the company. It is not about the commitment of the culture of the company. Really, it is about where the company is from, right? And that's the worry about being exposed to vulnerabilities in the supply chain, choke points in the supply chains, or their effect on domestic producers. So I think of geopolitical risk as being different from the other types in the fundamental way that geopolitical risk is really about corporate nationality. And that's the defining feature of risk.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting to hear about how it is really different from other disruptions, either from its own consequences and the ripple effect, or its nationality, or it's like how it's reshaping the supply chain. So this is really it's really good way to move to another to resilience and turning to resilience, and something that every executive is thinking about right now. So what strategies do you see as truly effective in building resilient supply chain, not just in theory, but also in practice? So what's your perspective into that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So resilience in the supply chain today goes beyond just reacting to shock. It's about anticipating and adapting to and strategically managing changing. That means approaching resilience not just as an operational issue, as I said before, but as a core part of business strategy. So I think there are three broad strategies that stand out, which are redundancy, flexibility, and visibility. So redundancy means building buffer like extra inventory or backup supplier or sourcing from multiple regions. It's not always efficient, but it provides a crucial assurance, especially during sanction or regional conflict like we are witness today. Clear example is how many firms began by investing away from a single source supplier in China during the US trade tension. Flexibility, on the other hand, involves design modular supply chain, sourcing alternative, and giving local team more autonomy to act quickly. It also includes using adapting contract and production process that can be reconfigured under stress. And finally, we have visibility, which is about knowing not just your direct suppliers, something that came up in the previous conversation, but also the deeper layer of the chain. Because many disruptions start in second and third tier suppliers. So technology like AI, blockchain can help, but the real values come from strong governance and clear accountability for risk oversight. So more broadly, firms need to institutionalize geopolitical risk into strategic decision, from procurement planning to site selection to boardroom discussion, what Vidya was mentioned before. So geopolitics can no longer be treated as a background noise, as we have been doing so far. We've been so lucky to have this privilege. It's now a central factor in sustained competitiveness. So ultimately, resilient supply chains are just robust, they are intelligent, they are dynamic, and designed for a world where disruption is the norm. I think I will stop here.
Thank you so much. Samuel?
Yeah, I think Grazia gave a great summary of kind of the key pillars of supply chain resilience. And I definitely echo the importance of using technology to have end-to-end supply chain visibility. I think we talk about visibility a lot in business schools, and we stress how important it is. But I think in the real world, not many companies actually have end-to-end supply chain visibility, especially when you have more complex supply chains like electronics or telecommunications. They've done multiple reports on multinational businesses in the S&P, as well as in the US listed stock exchanges, and they found that less than half of these businesses actually have visibility back to sort of the raw material extraction in their supply chain. So visibility is a great goal, but many companies still have a long ways to get there. And I think, building flexibility into your supply chain is also very important. I think what I am seeing in terms of flexibility is definitely a greater push towards diversification in the supply chain, having multiple sourcing locations, not having all of your eggs in one basket by spreading out manufacturing and suppliers across different geographical regions, even if they're more expensive. That's been a big shift. So having suppliers, let's say, because I'm in Canada, I know I talk about the US a lot. I'm literally just on about a half an hour away from the US border. So you have to understand, I'm kind of in the middle of all of this, what's going on over here at the moment. But when you look at North American companies, of course, diversification looks like having maybe lower cost sourcing in one supply chain coming from Southeast Asia. And then you might have, higher cost sourcing coming from Mexico or coming from a Latin American country because lead times are shorter. So businesses are building what I call these parallel supply chains, where you have a low cost and efficient supply chain and then a more responsive, adaptive supply chain to give you that ability to make these kind of more quicker shifts. But one of the things I did want to stress, and we haven't really talked about this, is it depends on the size of your business and it depends on the availability of your resources. So one of the key things that I found in my research, especially when we were looking at Brexit and the US-China trade war, is large multinational businesses, what they do is they'll look at the geopolitical picture and they'll do what I call worst case scenario planning. We found during Brexit, so when the UK was leaving the European Union, we did a study of GSK and AstraZeneca as well. AZ's been mentioned a couple of times here. And what we found is that these large multinationals, they didn't want to wait for 4 years for the policymakers to decide, oh, is the UK going to stay in the single market? Is it going to stay in the customs union? Or are we going to have this complete exit from the EU? What these businesses did within about a year of the Brexit vote is they said, okay, well, what's the worst case going to be? And the worst case is we're out of the single market, we're out of the currency union, And what we do is we plan for the worst case. So we actually set up a facility to do our customs clearance and our quality control in Europe. And these businesses literally invested $80 million into a new QC facility, quality control facility in Europe, so that they could bring their pharmaceuticals directly into Europe, bypass the UK entirely, bring them right into Europe, and then sell in the European market. Now, that's fine for large multinationals that have enough money to do that. What we found, though, is small and medium-sized businesses, so anywhere from 5 workers up to, let's say, 500 workers, those businesses were stuck. They had to actually, what we call, wait and see for the results of the Brexit decision to be realized. So they had to wait all the way until 2020. And this is after multiple say, we're leaving, we're not leaving, we're leaving, we're not leaving. And these businesses were essentially paralyzed. And they had to wait and see to find out what the final results was. And then they had to be reactive. So what I found in my research is that oftentimes we get sort of in our community, I would say in supply chain, we become very focused on multinationals, and they have the resources often. They have the ability to set up war rooms. They have the ability to get the next AI to look at end-to-end supply chain visibility, and all that's great. But a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises are paralyzed, especially right now with the US-China trade war and the global trade war that the States has initiated. These businesses really don't know what to do. They're hoping that the Trump administration is going to change its mind, and then they can continue to source from the European Union, or they can continue to source from China. But in the meantime, they're having to eat a lot of costs, and it's very expensive, and they're losing customers. And these companies are paralyzed, waiting and seeing what the end result is going to be. And it has a huge impact on businesses. And I do think that having that narrative is important within the supply chain community, that it really depends on the resource availability in terms of money, but as well as time. How many employees can you dedicate to managing geopolitical disruptions? Does your business have those resources available to do that?
That's really interesting, and also connecting this with the size and also the resources part, which is really critical for companies, especially when you say like smaller size, they have this kind of limitations and constraints. So thank you very much for bringing this perspective, Samuel. Srividya, so if you can share about some resilient or strategies for resilience in supply chain.
Yes. So I'm going to start again by saying, if we accept or if we agree that what is different about geopolitics is corporate nationality, that it is where you're from, that is one of the defining features of geopolitical risk being distinct or different from other things, then one view is that shaping that nationality is the most relevant strategy. How do you then think about a company? Like, what do you associate with a company? Right? And you care about this because of the risk that is perceived, not from the company itself, not from what it does, but because of where it is from. Right. So I think the 3 ways I think about this. One is outsiderness is a liability. Right? So being an outsider is a liability. Grazia, as well as Samuel mentioned this idea of sourcing and redundancy. I think this is key to kind of increasing local for local, greatest having more localization, having more the trade-off between efficiency versus just in case. I think you have more local production, you have more local sourcing, you have more localization this way, and greater subsidiary autonomy. Right? So you allow for these local managers, local subsidiaries to decide much more to kind of respond to what they're seeing within their immediate environments, much more than you have an integrated response. Another way of thinking about the outsiderness as a liability is maybe you just choose markets where you're not as much of an outsider. So this is the idea between friendshoring versus kind of bringing them back to friendly countries. So maybe you're choosing markets where outsiderness is low. So for me, one is thinking of outsiderness as a liability. The second is evaluating control rights. What governments really worry about is that the firm is being used as a conduit for something else. Right? So whether this is about data, whether this is about affecting domestic markets, domestic competition, domestic suppliers, that the firm itself, there are externalities to its action, and that is being affected not by its actions. So then the response will be to evaluate control rights. The response will be, how can my company, how can suppliers kind of think about their control rights in a way that makes them less of a perceived threat to another state, right? So there's a kind of interesting example. The Financial Times called this Singapore washing. So I live in Singapore, and there are many companies that have moved their headquarters, many Chinese companies that have moved their headquarters from China to Singapore. The Financial Times called this Singapore washing as a way of saying, they moved their headquarters, but the idea really is that they have moved their control rights from that is encased within the headquarters into a location which is seen as less, quote unquote, less threatening to some contexts, right? And then the final point, I think, is managing perceptions of corporate nationality. And so Singapore washing may be one way of doing that, but other ways of doing that would include things like you spin out businesses, you make some of them more independent, you choose locations where the companies, the subsidiaries have more control. So there is managing the perceptions of corporate nationality. How can you be seen as less threatening, to be seen as more legitimate, to be seen as more of an insider? And then the last point I want to touch on, what Samuel was mentioning, this difference or this dissonance between what large companies can do and can achieve versus the big disadvantage that small and medium-sized companies have. This is expensive, right? This is really hard to do, to keep on top of things, to, like if you want to move supply chains, or if you want to create redundancies, if you want to give local subsidiaries much more autonomy, you want to create other types of control rights to be shifted elsewhere. This is hard, this is expensive, this is out of the possibility for many companies, right? So not everyone is able to do this. But on the other hand, I also think that it's precisely because it is hard that it may be credible, that it works as a signal, precisely because it is hard to do and it is difficult to achieve.
Very, very interesting perspective. Thank you very much, Srividya. And on this point, I was wondering, do you think global supply chains, as we know them now, are fading? Is the future is more regional or more localized supply chain? So maybe you touched on this point slightly before, but I'm just curious to know more. Is it more localized, regional, or we still think about the global supply chain? Grazia? Grazia?
Yes, so you are asking about whether the supply chain is coming to an end, right? Or
Yeah.
So I think the era of global supply chain is not ending, but it's been fundamentally reshaping from exactly what we have been discussing so far. So we are seeing not a full retreat into localization, but rather a strategic recalibration, often referred to as a selective regionalization or de-risking. So many firms are rethinking a supply chain footprint, shifting from operation closer to key market to reduce exposure to geopolitical tension, trade union, or over dependence on a single country. A good example is Apple's China Plus One strategy. The company has long relied heavily on China's manufacturing, but in recent years it has actively expanded production in other countries like India, for example, and Vietnam. The goal isn't to leave China entirely, but to diversify risk while maintaining global efficiency. Well, that said, global network remain essential, especially for industry that rely on specialized supplier or innovation hubs that can be easily duplicated locally. So in this sense, we are not witnessing the end of globalization, but the emergence of a smarter, more resilient supply chain, maybe more subtle strategy, which of course require a lot of resources. So large companies, let's say, that have an advantage towards smaller businesses. So ultimately, we are moving toward a hybrid models that blend global reach with the regional buffers. and necessary response to a world where geopolitical risk is no longer a background variable, but a central factor in supply chain strategy. So basically here I want to echo what both Samuel and Vidya touched upon. All this turmoil is very much affecting whole company, but the ability of the company to react is very much depend on the company exposure. Some companies are more exposed than others for different reasons, the industry they operate, and also their resources and capabilities. It is what will set apart like large more corporation from small businesses.
Thank you so much. Samuel?
Yeah, as usual, great points from Grazia, and I have to echo that. I think what we have to look at, though, is sort of what are the drivers of this shift that we're seeing in global supply chains. And I will call them global supply chains because essentially companies are still global in nature, but they are becoming much more targeted in terms of the markets that they're selling into and how their supply chains are designed. And that is really being driven by government policy. So within the supply chain domain, I've been really sort of arguing for you cannot treat the supply chain as an isolated, being that just exists and sort of operates wherever it wants into the world. It is highly driven by, of course, by policy decisions. And what we're seeing, of course, is been a shift, at least in the Western world, towards protectionism. So if we look at the US, of course, the protectionism really started in 2016 with Donald Trump's election, and that has continued until today. We've also seen a lean towards protectionism within the UK, of course, with Brexit, and they're wanting to, of course, protect their own borders, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. There was a huge push in the UK when I lived there for onshoring and localization. And the protection of critical industries. The European Union as well, with if you look at the CHIPS Act in the EU, as well as, of course, in the US, they're actually designing policy and giving huge billions of dollars worth of incentives for semiconductor supply chains to be established in the EU, as well as in the States. And we're also seeing kind of this desire to have more protected supply chains, even in China at the moment. And one of the things that was picked up on earlier was the China +1 strategy. That really is no longer exists, in my opinion. It is China for China. So AstraZeneca is a perfect example that Srividya mentioned earlier. AZ has a Chinese supply chain, including the APIs and the excipients and all of the things that go into the pharmaceutical products housed within China itself to sell to the Chinese market. And this supply chain that AZ has set up, interestingly enough, has been actually copied by GSK. But GSK is doing it in the States instead. So GSK is looking at manufacturing within the US, trying to get more of their APIs out of China and having that sort of more localized. And they're trying to have sort of a US for US type of supply chain design. So you're getting this sort of dichotomy or bifurcation in the supply chain where companies are saying, okay, well, what are our key markets? Where do we want to grow? And how do we begin to sort of set up those supply chains independently so they're not affected by these huge policy shifts that are coming fast and furious, especially over the past sort of 7 or 8 years.
Thank you so much, Samuel. Srividya?
Yeah, I think I largely agree with what both Grazia and Samuel have said. I think the idea that global networks are changing, but not necessarily, we're seeing a transformation of these global networks, right? So there's more resilience, it's more localized, and just in time is obviously being transformed into just in case. I think there's two kind of angles to think about. One, Grazia already mentioned this in terms of innovation. Right? So we know that the kind of the big problems of large-scale problems, global problems require global solutions anyway. So in that sense, we need to have some amount of global integration, global supply chains that can tailor to that, and innovations that come from different parts that are integrated and provide solutions around the world. I think another kind of question that I have, and maybe the others have a view on this, is is the risk appetite really changing, right? So this is maybe not so much about, there's a part of it which is about resilience. There's a part of it which is about, let's reduce the choke points. Let's reduce our dependence. Let's diversify the risk. But I also wonder if the risk appetite is changing. It's not, even if a firm or industry is not, maybe currently targeted or affected, but the potential for it to be affected in the future still exists. And when companies see other companies doing similar things, then they will reevaluate their own perceptions. And so I wonder also if in the past they might have opted for more global supply chains, even if the pressures don't require them to, is the risk appetite of different companies really changing? And I don't have an answer for that, but I'd be curious to hear what others think about it.
Really very interesting question and very interesting point. I mean, if there's like really the companies, how they see risk and their appetite for risk is changing or not. That's very interesting. On the point, because you also mentioned innovation and technologies briefly, I would like to ask a question for Samuel. Given you also your research highlight the power of digital transformation and different technologies. So my question is like, how are technologies like AI, blockchain, or other technologies helping firms mitigate geopolitical risk? And are there any particular innovations you see stand out or like game changer in the supply chain resilience?
Yeah, okay, great question. So I think technology is an enabler, as always, especially novel technologies. I think I'll focus primarily, well, let me start with blockchain, because blockchain is one of these technologies that has been sort of heralded as the next thing that is going to give supply chains end-to-end visibility, et cetera. It has had a very difficult adoption. If we look at IBM and Maersk, who has set up a really sort of neat blockchain offering that they were going to give to all of Maersk's customers, so they could have tracking of customs documentation end to end, and then they could also have more sort of visibility of where their products were being manufactured, as well as how raw materials were being extracted. And they had developed quite this robust blockchain technology, and they tried to sell it to their different customers and get them on board. But they then had to actually discontinue the TradeLens offering about 2 years ago because they weren't finding enough uptake by businesses. And that was mainly down to, first of all, the cost of adoption, but also trying to get your sub-tier suppliers to adopt that technology. They found was very, very difficult. So Volkswagen, for instance, they're also doing something in the blockchain space. They're having a lot of challenges to get especially the raw material suppliers, people that are extracting, cobalt in the DRC, doing the mining. They don't have the money, the space, or the technology to bring on blockchain technology, as well as sort of the processors of these materials. And getting sort of this end-to-end adoption of technology, especially blockchain, has been very, very difficult. We are seeing, of course, other more promising technologies, in my opinion, of course, is AI. Predictive analytics is being adopted across a lot of big multinational companies. But again, AI is being used primarily for forecasting. It's being used for demand planning. It's being used for route optimization. It's having more difficulty using AI for end-to-end supply chain visibility, again, because of this issue where the focal firm, usually the large multinational, has the resources to adopt it, to bring it on board, to make it fit with their existing IT systems. But when they try to roll it out to their suppliers, they're like, well, this is too expensive. We're already giving you all of the information that you've asked us for. You can't possibly ask us to bring on another cost when our margins are already so thin. we can't afford to bring on this new technology. So rolling AI out beyond the boundaries of the firm to suppliers, especially to sub-tier suppliers, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers, is becoming a huge challenge. So I do think there is a huge potential, of course, in AI, but there are those adoption issues in the sub-tiers of the supply chain, which is making it challenging. One of the technologies that I'm really interested in, though, is additive manufacturing and 3D printing. And I do think this is very transformative. So if we look at additive manufacturing and its use in the aerospace industry, just because I did my PhD at Rolls-Royce and they were developing additive manufacturing there for use in aerospace engine parts. They've actually, they're now printing aerospace parts that are flying around in aircraft as we speak. So the technology I would say from about 2005 to about, to just recently has gone up in leaps and bounds. And we are seeing the adoption of additive manufacturing going beyond the aerospace realm into automotive. So there's been a lot of adoption of 3D printing in the automotive realm. If we look at Volkswagen, we're seeing it as well as Audi, BMW. And these companies are beginning to not just do additive manufacturing, but they're having machines alongside of their existing production lines, or they're using it to manufacture tooling or to help with rapid prototyping. And they're beginning to bring that technology into their supply chains. Why I think 3D printing is so valuable in terms of these changing global supply chains is when we can have sort of banks of 3D printers that are located close to the market, it allows companies to have production for their major markets in those major markets. And the nice thing about 3D printing is you can take a computer-aided design, you take that design, you upload it into the cloud, it can be rolled out to all of your banks of printers that are located around the world. And those printers can begin to churn out new parts and new final products in various manufacturing facilities around the world. So when we talk about regionalization, I really see additive manufacturing as a key tool to allow companies to have more regionalized supply chains, to begin to use 3D printing, to begin to what's called have more sort of redistributed manufacturing around the world. And it creates a lot more flexibility, of course, because your printers are now located closer to the centers of demand. You have shorter lead times. And at the same time, you have a lot fewer requirements for input parts, so intermediary parts, because the 3D printers can make a lot of those parts themselves. So all you then need is the powders, the metallic powders, or the plastic polymers that go into the machines, and you can reduce the extended supply chain of components and input parts that go into those 3D printers. So I would really say that, in my opinion, additive manufacturing is one tool that is really allowing this regionalization of supply chains at the moment, especially in automotive, aerospace, and telecommunications at the moment.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Samuel, and also nice comparison between different technologies and how this applied in different contexts like aerospace and also automotive and other industries. Thank you so much. Now moving to question to Grazia. So in your research, you explored how multinational enterprise deal with uncertainty. So how are firms rethinking international strategies and knowledge flows in the climate of disruptions? And in particular, what about the intangible assets like knowledge and reputation? So I'm curious to know about your perspective into that.
Yes, thank you. I think let me take a broader answer to your question. I think what we are witness teach us that there is no one-size-fits-all responses, and the firm are adopting a different strategy depending on, again, as we said before, the exposure industry and resources. So some are taking traditional routes like exit marketing or scale down operation. Take, for example, the example of Shell, that after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 announced a complete exit from its joint venture in Russia, including its stake in the Sakhalin 2 gas project. So this decision involves significant financial losses, but it reflects also the growing reality that geopolitical and reputational risk can outweigh the benefit of market access, because remaining in Russia may create for some company like Shell, which is headquartered in the Netherlands, which is an institutional strong country with a vibrant civil society, reputational backlash, and negative reputational spillover. But there are other companies that have adopted a more strategic approach. So some firms have restructured their ownership or legal entity to create what we call strategic organizational distance, something that are currently working on. So basically like insulating local operation from action target at the parent company. So basically is obscuring the tie between the local unit in a hostile country and his parent company home country. And this allowed this company to reduce regulatory exposure and operate autonomously in more sensitive region. Why this might be the solution to the geopolitical risk, because you can still operate in the country, so you avoid like sunk cost or scaling down your operation. At the same time, the implementation of the strategy, so creating this strategic organization, this may involve creating shell company or offshore entity, or increase of obscuring your parent corporate identity, something that Vidya was touching before, which some company from specific country may afford, while some other may have again backlash, starting from their employee that do not know about what the corporate identity of the company is, or from the shareholder that may not provide support to the company. So all these reputational considerations make the strategizing in a situation of geopolitical risk much more complex. Going back to the technology, because not just about physical operation, we see that what is at stake most often in this geopolitical tension for company is their intangible. And so the question that comes is how to protect them, how to protect technology, how to protect intellectual property. There was an interesting article in the Washington Post about how, for example, China is weaponizing its court. How can company react? Something that I'm carrying the research on with some colleague is how company can basically arbitrage across different forum across border, and basically being selective on the type of forum where they litigated. And the reason is just to create deterrence for future litigation by showing that if they could win in specific forum, so they have a case, they will be less likely to be attacked. This is the case of a company deciding to litigate, for example, in a country that have a reputation for the neutrality of their court. So court that will decide not based on the political influence of their government. So a court where in the courtroom you will have justice and not political game going over. And this is especially important when a dispute involve a company that are originating from country with strained relationship. So the common thread across this strategy is a recognition that geopolitics is not just a temporary distraction, something that we touch upon by structural change. And navigating requires a combination of operational flexibility, legal foresight, and the ability to rethink how and where the firm operates globally. So not just reducing the risk, but to sustain long-term competitiveness.
This is really interesting point, and also I like also you talking about the combination approach, so at the operational regulations and also the strategic part that you are mentioning. Thank you so much. And this is really lead us to the talking about the government and also the policy and institution. So Srividya, you study the intersection of firms and government. So how do geopolitical disruptions create both frictions and opportunity in those relationships between the, let's say, government and firms? And what role should government and international bodies play in supporting supply chain resilience?
Yeah, I think this is obviously a clear case of where there's great interdependency between the firm and the state. The actions of the firm are going to be highly conditioned by what policies are adopted, and in turn, states are worried about actions of specific companies. So I think there's a great interdependence between the two. The fundamental issue is that externalities matter. The externalities of foreign investment. What is good for the firm may or may not be good for the state. And that's when we see this dissonance. That's where we see this challenge of managing foreign investment and the politics of foreign investment coming in, right? So NVIDIA is a great example. NVIDIA has a significant share of their sales from China, right? And that's great for NVIDIA to keep selling to Chinese markets, but that's exactly what the US state sees differently, right? So the externalities are felt beyond what is necessarily just constrained within the firm. So it's the sense of externalities of foreign investment. What is good for the firm may or may not be good for the state, and you see this kind of interdependence coming in very clearly. From my perspective, I think there are at least 4 ways in which this interdependence is felt. One is about market access. It's who gets access to which type of markets. So that's the policy tools are many. Tariffs are one of them, but you could think of many other types of policy tools as well, whether this is non-tariff barriers, whether this is other ways of home country regulation, host country regulation. Grazia talked about courts as well, whether courts are selectively enforcing certain regulations or not. So the policy tools are many, but one of the big implications is about market access. Who has access and to which market? So where does the firm, what is really your choice set? Like, where can you invest as a company? Where can you create partnerships? Where can you have source from? The second is about level playing field. So if competitors in a market have to face different challenges, different regulations, different costs of entering the market, then obviously the playing field becomes much less uneven. The third is about investment security. So when companies are investing in foreign markets where they create partnerships with second, third, fourth degree suppliers, or whether they invest by themselves, what confidence do they have that these investments are something that they can continue to generate rents from, that they can continue to ensure the safety and operationability of their investments that they have. And then the final thing is about standards, right? So when there is contention, and we see multiple standards evolving, obviously that is inefficient, but that also creates a lot of challenges for companies in terms of increasing costs. Having to make the choice, which standard do I want to tie into? And we know that those who control the standards control the market. So there is this competition also in terms of standards, what standards are being established, who determines those standards, how those standards are negotiated, whether it's through multilateral agencies, whether it is through individual countries' adoption of specific types of standards, which standards prevail. And this also creates a lot of confusion in the meantime about the evolution of those standards. So I see kind of this interaction between firms and states really spilling over into these different terrains.
Thank you so much, Srividya, for this very insightful answer about this relationship and also what could be done for that. Thank you so much. As we wrap up, I would like each of you to share one insight or key insight into what one piece of advice you would offer to businesses or policymakers trying to future-proof their supply chain today. So what's your advice for them, for businesses and policymakers? Grazia?
Yes, I think I will be very brief here. For business, I think it's mandatory to make sure that geopolitics is an entire part of their strategy, as we have been discussing. Is not something that happens infrequently or randomly. Therefore, anticipating this strategy, so building an strategic mindset that is about anticipating the change and act upon it rather than react upon it. So what is required is a global intelligence for local resilience. And this mind change starts by investing in people, team leaders that understand the geopolitical development, that monitor this development, and that are able to translate signal into strategies. It's also about understand that the strategic toolkit is not just about market strategy, but also non-market strategy, like, for example, capacity building, advocacy, global intelligence gathering, both at home and abroad. And finally, I think business is clear by now that they should use any tool, whether it is the organization or the legal structure that they have at disposal in order to reduce the political exposure and anticipate political risk.
Thank you so much, Grazia. Samuel?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. If we just look at what's happening in Canada at the moment, and businesses here are looking towards diversification, not being so reliant on the US market for their sales, as well as for their supply. And Canadian businesses are looking to diversify to other markets, and all of that is fine. And I think businesses are setting up strategy around how to do that. But the reality is that businesses cannot do that without the help of policymakers. And policymakers are the ones that make the free trade agreements. So in Canada, for instance, we have had a free trade agreement that we've been trying to develop with China for the past 10 years. We've had a free trade agreement with India that has been in the works for the past 6 years. And these free trade agreements keep getting stopped or disrupted for political reasons. And businesses are saying, well, I do want to sell into these markets, but the cost of doing so is so high. Policymakers, you need to help me. So there needs to be a lot more coordinated effort between policymakers actually sitting down with the heads of multinational businesses, but as well as with trade associations. Trade associations are important because they represent small and medium-sized enterprises. And you can have sort of the voice of the SMEs given to policymakers through these trade associations. And I think when businesses and policymakers sit down, they map their supply chains, they understand where the critical points of failure are, and the policymakers say, well, how can we help you? And you get this direction of travel towards going out and striking these bilateral, multilateral trading agreements, something that is a lot more coordinated and targeted. At the moment, I'll speak for Canada anyway, it's totally piecemeal. We're all moving in different directions, but we all really want the same thing, is to be less reliant on the United States. So you have to have that coordination between policymakers and businesses today.
Thank you so much, Samuel. Srividya?
Thank you. I think I want to echo something that Grazia already said. I really liked how she put it, signal to strategies. Attention is very limited, right? So whether this is policymakers, whether this is business managers, they have thousands of things on their plates every day, and attention is limited. So really, the key question is, how do we go from all of the information that they are receiving? And I completely agree with Samuel that we need to have this coordinated response and really an integrated way of thinking about this. But these are still complex issues, and there is very little, kind of here the best case rule of thumb, best practices that we could readily take off the shelf. That is really limited in this instance. So I think really thinking through, how do we translate these information, the potential ways of thinking about this and transforming that into business strategy, I think is really the core issue. And there is some amount of specialization going on, which is what external consultants can provide, what external vendors, what consulting companies, think tanks, what the kind of information that they can provide, the kind of guidance that they can offer. But that in some ways is only the starting point. Because this has to be incorporated within the company. This has to be incorporated into, what are my company's strengths? How does this information fit? What's the relevance? Which parts of my company are going to be affected by this? So really internalizing some of that into the company's operations, I think is critical.
That's really a very interesting point. So like having the strategic mindset about anticipating what might happen and like thinking about our focus, because as you mentioned, we have like limited attention, and also highlighting the cooperation and having like this kind of everyone to be involved, having some collaboration between policymakers and firms. Really very good points to wrap up with the moderation and the question session. So thank you very much for your insights. Now we will have like a briefly short presentation about the AMP, the Academy of Management Perspective, a special issue, managing for our new normal. So Grazia and Srividya, if you would like to talk about the special issue, and then we will take the questions from the audience and wrap up the session.
Sure, I'll give it a start. So this is an Academy of Management Perspective special issue on managing under political turbulence, a practical solution for coping with risk, rising geopolitical risk, sorry. The deadline is September 30, 2026, and I and Srividya are two of the four guest editors. The other two are Jonathan Doe from Villanova University and Yangdong Luo from University of Miami. Each of us has an interest in geopolitics, and we look forward to work together. A bit about the special issue, what I would like to highlight in this stage is the fact that AMP mission format differs from many other leading journals. So what we are looking for, aligned with the mission format of the journal, are papers that are managerially driven and not theory driven. And so successful submission should define clearly what is the managerial issue from the onset and make a compelling case. So it's not the standard paper where the managerial issue will come at the very end, but is a different type of paper where the managerial issue will be on the far front and will actually lead the development of the study. So ideally, the contribution that we look for are a paper that provide evidence and actionable insight that then can credibly guide managerial behavior and influence policy decision. We have a number of aspects that are highlighted in the special issue, from understanding different types of foreign political turbulence to rethinking corporate political strategy. So these have to be regarded a potential contributor as a window of opportunity, but we are open at also to other issues that may resonate with the special issue topics. I think I will stop here to give Srividya also an opportunity to talk about the special issue and also to ideally have some questions that we can handle during the Q&A.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Grazia. I just want to add very quickly to what has already been said. I'm excited to work on this special issue. And again, just want to reiterate what Grazia said, because this is the mission of the journal, the Academy of Management Perspectives, is to be more managerially driven, where there's direct evidence. The idea of the article should be to provide direct evidence of actionable managerial implications and policies, right? So it's not something that comes at the end, but that should in some sense be the motivating question of the article itself. While that is, the format is, not format, but the perspective is pretty clear, but we really are open to many different ways of thinking about this, the different topics, the different perspectives that come into this, the approaches, the methodologies. I think we are really much more open in terms of, we encourage diverse submissions on these things. We have provided some guidelines on just first way of thinking about this, but it's by no means an exhaustive list in the call that we have. Again, the deadline is 30th of September, 2026, and we are hoping to receive a lot of submissions, and I hope there is interest in this, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Very interesting special issue, and I think it's very much relevant to what we discussed today, so thank you so much for sharing this. Mohammed, do you have any questions from the audience?
Yes. Yes, we have several questions, but first of all, I want to make sure that our guests have time to stay with us for a few minutes more. Yeah, so I think, okay, great. So Rima also, I think the panelists also see the questions, yeah? So, and then they can pick up the questions that is more they like to answer. Yeah, so we have 2 questions, and one question went to the Q&A. 2 questions in the chat box.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
personally, I had the questions about at the beginning. Someone mentioned about friendshoring, and but I just a quick question. What do you think about moving towards a kind of hidden supply chains? What do you think about it? They try to hide information about their supply chains, about their suppliers. Do we see some kind of trends toward this or not?
Yeah, great question, Mohammed. I'm actually just writing an article on covert supply chains for IJOPM. And what we're identifying there is that, yes, there is definitely I don't know if it's a trend, but we are seeing a lot of activity around disguising or hiding supply chain activities. In the realm of sort of geopolitical disruptions, a lot of that hiding takes place in terms of customs declarations, where companies are reporting that their goods come from. So they're changing their bills of lading, they're changing their commercial invoices. So just doctoring those invoices to basically say, actually, we didn't make this product in China, we made it in, let's say, Indonesia. Our suppliers are located in Indonesia, and it only contains these particular products. And then those products are sent under incorrect bills of lading into the United States, and they don't receive the full tariff on, let's say, Chinese imports, for instance. So changes in documentation is one. We're also seeing instances where companies are doing what's called tariff engineering. So they are changing a particular part of their product. So let's say, for instance, I am manufacturing an electronic good. I might add on an additional redundant piece to my let's say my laptop. I might try to kind of create an additional thing code that my product is coming in under, and therefore I receive a lower tariff rate on that particular good. And when I bring it into the United States, I bring it into a free trade zone. I then change that product back to its original state, and then I sell it underneath as a normal laptop. So by doing that, I am able to do what's called tariff engineering and avoid a lot of sort of the high tariffs on goods. I think we're going to see a lot of that now, especially because tariffs are so high, and the U.S. government is doing a lot of carve-outs for, let's say, cell phones and for also other types of products that are coming in from China. So I do see that sort of hidden nature of supply chains coming out as a way to get around a lot of these policy decisions.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is about, can you share some ideas on how to quantify the dollar effect of reshoring due to Trump's tariff policy changes? Can this cost be attributed to few events alone? Vinet Menon mentioned this. If you want, you can, if I'm not sure if Vinet is with us or not, but any thoughts on these questions or suggestions?
I don't want to dominate all of the answers. Grazia or Srividya, did you want to take that one?
No, please go ahead. I think you had the point on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening is we are seeing a devaluation of the U.S. dollar. We are seeing a lot of the BRICS nations in particular, so Brazil, Russia, China, a more of concerted effort to no longer trade in U.S. currency. And that is becoming sort of this polarizing force against the U.S. dollar. Very, very difficult to do. Of course, the entire financial system is set up around the U.S. dollar. But what's happening at the same time, of course, as BRICS are trying to get away from the U.S. dollar, the tariff policy is beginning to devalue the U.S. dollar as well, especially in relation to the euro as well as the Canadian dollar. And as the U.S. dollar falls, we then begin to see imports becoming a lot more expensive for US firms. So like I said in my earlier presentation, not only do companies now have to pay the cost of the import tariffs, they have to do so with a weaker US dollar. And that makes the cost of goods much more expensive for US businesses. Over the long term, if the US dollar does devalue, I think this is probably Trump's overall strategy, is having a lower US dollar makes US exports more attractive. And he anticipates that that will be a lever for reshoring to the United States. Of course, I don't believe that, but I won't get into kind of all the reasons behind that at the moment. But certainly that is where the US administration hopes the devaluation of the dollar will get them to.
Yes. And I copied the questions of Marcelo in the chat box.
Maybe I can quick go ahead with that very shortly. I don't think that building or acquire resilience capability can be put on the side. I think if anything, the world is getting more complex, especially for company, no matter the size of the company. And so in order to face this new normal, the acquiring and developing resilience capability should be complemented by exploiting government mechanism and international policy framework. So basically, it's not doing less, but it's actually doing more for company. As I mentioned before, is just adding to the traditional market strategy, non-market strategy, more innovative solution to what they are living. And just a short comment about hidden supply chain. This is not an option available to all company. Company more vibrant civil society can get a lot of pushback from shareholder, from consumer boycott, for NGO. So that might be a solution to survive the market, but not to survive society in these countries. I'll keep it shorter. I know we are over time, so that Vidya gets a chance also to comment on this.
Thank you. I'll take the question on corporate nationality. I think it's not an either or. So in that sense, I agree with Grazia that there is definitely much more careful attention that needs to be paid to resilience capabilities. But on the other hand, I also think that if the fundamental problem is corporate nationality, and you may or may not agree with me on that, but to the extent that we conclude that the big difference about geopolitical risk is stemming from corporate nationality, then companies are going to have to deal with this issue, whether they like it or not. And we already see many kinds of ways of governance around it. We're seeing increasingly companies talking about licensing, where previously FDI would have been the most logical way of expanding into a given market. We are seeing even different types of technologies being licensed, different types of market entry strategies that are being designed. We are seeing companies reorganizing the governance of their, even to the extent of spinning out different regions as separate entities. So, companies like Sequoia Capital, for example, I know it's not supply chain, but is an example of how they have regionally divided the entities into separate legal entities that are then, even competing with each other over the same business. So I think that they will have to deal with these issues. This is how it's an important component. The resilience doesn't go away, but this is an important component, and they have to deal with it in some meaningful ways. So yes, to answer the question, I think there is a lot of research to be done on those topics, and I see that as promising.
Yeah, thank you. That was the last question, Rima.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your insightful conversation, and for sharing your research and your perspective into the geopolitical disruptions and resilient supply chain. It was really a pleasure to have you all with us, Grazia, Samuel, and Srividya. It's really been interesting for us. We learned so much about different areas about this topic in geopolitical disruptions. So thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to have you with us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thank you.